We'll get going. Hi, and welcome to the very first SBOM live seminar with SBOM Europe. I'm Olle Johansson, and my co-host here is Anthony. Hi, Anthony.
Hello everyone. Yes, and with a UK accent, but it's great to see there's a few UK participants in the chat. So yes, this is Europe, in the great continent of Europe, not just the EU.
Right, and can you tell us a little bit more about who you are?
So yes, I am a experienced engineer. I have spent a career delivering mission critical software and systems since the last century. And by mission critical systems, I mean systems that are complex and probably never finish because they're continually evolving. Generally in what you might call the infrastructure projects, like power systems, energy systems, and maybe national security. I have a strong background in software development, system development, cyber engineering, both at a practitioner level and a technical leader. And I am now heavily involved in trying to make software more secure. So I created a business called APH10 a couple of years ago to try and make this on a mission to make software more secure.
Great. And I'm Olle Johansson. I've been involved in open source for a very long time. I used to be one of the developers in the Asterisk open source project. I'm also a consultant working with security, PKI, and software supply chain security. So I've been diving down into the Cyber Resilience Act and SBOMs for a while and became active in OWASP, which I will tell you more about later. So welcome. Our agenda today is that we're going to give you a short introduction. This is the first seminar with SBOM Europe. So we're going to tell you a bit about our ideas and what you can expect from us in the future. Then we're going to do a very, very short presentation about the software bill of materials, what it is and how we see it, and continue with a discussion about the state of SBOM. We have prepared a few statements that we're going to use to lead the discussion, and feel free to join in. After that, I'm going to speak a little bit about the software bill of materials in the newly adopted Cyber Resilience Act in the European Union. And then we're going to open up for questions and answers. Are we ready, Anthony?
Let's go.
Let's go. So SBOM Europe started as an idea a while ago, and we really launched it at the Nordic Software Security Summit this year in Stockholm. It was in September, and it was a two-day conference on the topic of the software regulation. In particular, in focus was the Cyber Resilience Act. But we felt that there's a need for a European community. We've been part of many communities, mostly hosted in the US, in US time zones, and with the US regulation as a focus. So we wanted to start a community with a bit more European focus. And we're going to run a couple of different events. Where this will end, we don't know. There will possibly be changes as we learn. The SBOM live seminars like this one is 1 hour seminars with various topics. We can invite guests, and we have a lot of interested ideas and some people standing by. And we will have demonstrations of software. We're going to run these live on Zoom with participants, but also record them and publish on our YouTube channel. The main place, apart from our own website, where we announce the seminars, is on LinkedIn, as you probably have noticed. We're also going to record seminars that are real tutorials, 1 hour recorded tutorials on various topics. We have a lot to say and a lot of slides prepared for this. And that could be introduction to software transparency with SBOMs, but also how the SBOM fits into supply chain security, how you do due diligence, how you manage vulnerability handling automatically with SBOMs, and many other things. I know Anthony has written a lot of tools and a platform for software transparency. So we do have things to talk about here. And there are always news coming, and we felt we needed a way. We keep chatting between ourselves when we find a new paper or a new statement or something new happening somewhere in the world. Recently, we've seen NIS2 implementation guidelines. We've seen SBOM requirements from India and the German authorities. So there are a lot of things happening, and we wanted to have a format where we can quickly record quick updates. So we're going to do that hopefully in what we call the SBOM updates. But let's start now. And Anthony, what is an SBOM, and why do I look at a hamburger?
Okay, right. So the best way of describing an SBOM I've always found is by an analogy, and something we all understand is food. And whenever we go to any restaurant these days, before we even sit down and get given the menu, the first thing it says is, have we got any allergies? And why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that because that's part of their risk process. They're trying to understand is, if you're allergic to maybe peanuts, do they have to do certain, make sure you're sitting in a particular place, maybe free from nuts or like. And the same thing is about software. We need to understand how our software is constructed, what the ingredients are that's going into our software applications. So in the same way that a restaurant is understanding what's gone into their burger, then we need to understand what's gone into our software. So really what you're looking at is the ingredients of your software, like the ingredients of your hamburger. But really it gets deeper than that, because really you want to see, and where have those ingredients come from? So that is when we really want to look at the supply chain. Where has the meat come from? Where has the mayonnaise come from? And is that fresh and appropriate? So therefore, we need to understand not just the end product, we need to understand the journey of how the end product is being produced from the supply chain. So you need to go down and say, okay, in the same way the burgers, you've got to talk to your butcher and working out where he's got the meat from, and he's probably got it from a farmer. So where's the farmer? How's the farmer looking after the cows? Going down and down and down. And what we also want to do is we want to make sure the ingredients are fresh. When you're eating our menu, we want fresh ingredients. The same thing is we want to know whether our software is fresh. And the analogy for fresh software is up-to-date software or maintained software. So really what we want to try and do is understand that whole journey of the software from its creation all the way through to its delivery and deployment. It's not easy. There's a lot of things that are unknown. So it is a journey. And I think as people are trying to find, explore SBOMs, we're starting to find maybe we don't understand the supply chain as well as we thought we did, or the supply chain isn't as transparent as it needs to be. So we need to start working on that and getting better quality data. The other thing is that we also need to recognise that go back one slide, Ole. In the same way that a hamburger, my son will have a different hamburger to me. He doesn't like lettuce. So we also have to think about how we manage different product variants of that ultimate product. So therefore, did you get the lettuce or not? So therefore, we need to think about how the way we can manage variants of products in a software in our software delivery. So yeah, next slide now, Ole.
There are large parts of our industry who make custom-made software where yes, every customer get different components. So that is important.
Yes.
Well,
and I think the important thing is, as this picture shows, it shows a hierarchy, and it is, you might be at the top of the tree, but actually, how much do you know about, 2 or 3 levels away from that in terms of and what risk may they be exposing you to. So the risk of software of a food is you get a food allergy and maybe you get ill. The risk for software is you get a vulnerability and you get exploited. So that's a sort of the loose analogy of a software illness is a vulnerability. A food allergy could lead to a sickness. Do you want to add on a bit more about this, Ole?
No. I mean, as a lactose intolerant person, I understand the need for this because when I do shop groceries, I always have to read the list of the ingredients. And I usually say when I speak about this that, well, I'm also have an allergy to CURL, the curl package. And how do I know whether I have a curl in my platform or the stuff I'm buying from Amazon? It's really hard knowing what's in a piece of software or an embedded system. And we all saw that a lot of these discussions started with Log4j because there was so much money spent just on the question, am I affected? Trying to figure out within an IT infrastructure whether or not we had Log4j and which systems were affected and how they were affected. So with software transparency, including SBOMs, customers will have a solution for finding out and making their own priorities. I think that's a very important piece of the puzzle.
And I think we all know, the Log4j thing that happened, nearly 3 years ago. I think a lot of people have learned an awful lot that they didn't realize how software had become so complex and so interrelated with lots of third-party components that they had no knowledge of. And as we all know, Friday afternoon, and when everyone's about to go home for a weekend, that's when vulnerabilities often happen. So Log4j was on a Friday afternoon when I remember it. So, you don't want to spoil your weekend to say, am I affected? You want to be able to quickly identify, is there an issue? Do we have to care about it? And software bill of materials are very useful way of helping answer that question. They won't answer all the questions, but they will answer some of the questions quickly.
And the interesting thing is that SBOMs right now is positioned heavily towards vulnerability management, but they all started with software license compliance in the open source world. And we don't know what other usages will be coming, but we'll monitor that in SBOM Europe. This is a topic, as you hear, we can speak about for a very, very long time, and we're going to do that. But we're going to record an SBOM introduction in the SBOM Academy and publish fairly soon because we do have that material ready. But let's move on to the next point of bullet in the agenda, the state of SBOM. And here we have prepared a few statements. We see that there has been a lot of expectations of SBOMs, especially with the pressure from authorities all over the world. And we are beginning to see in various forums the hype death that people say, well, wasn't there more with SBOMs? It doesn't work and all of that. So let's discuss where we are. But the first statement here is that, well, the SBOM is positioned to be the silver bullet for all kinds of problems. What do you think, Anthony? Is it?
No, to be honest. I think what SBOMs are starting to highlight is how little people know about the process of constructing software. It's so easy now for the developer to just go onto GitHub or just download a bit of software, add it to their software build, and use it. But lots of organizations don't have sort of strict policies in terms of controlling how those third parties come in. Are you validating whether that component is a risk to your organization? Is that software being maintained? Is that software known vulnerabilities. And I think, you know, an SBOM is something that was suggested when the US issued their exec order in May 2021 as a potential solution to help make people more aware of the supply chain. SBOM on its own right will not make your software more secure. SBOM is just an artifact, but you can use that as part of your software development process or your system development process. And it's probably going to improve your quality of your product. So, you know, it is not the silver bullet, but it's a really important artifact, and it's going to reveal a lot of things you probably didn't know about. And it's going to give you a few sleepless nights as well. But you know, the end game is it's going to improve the software. Your software resilience is going to improve your product.
I think we're only at the beginning of our SBOM journey, to be realistic. There are many tools now that produce the SBOM for a company, and most of them produce rubbish, not very useful documents. And we still have to learn what is a useful SBOM and how can we use that in the process. And also, I believe that the SBOM I want internally in a project is not the same as the one I want to hand over to a customer. So we're at the beginning of an exciting journey, but there's still ways to go.
And I think when the SBOM came out, sort of gained more popularity, everyone thought the process was just creation. I think it very quickly became apparent creation is just the start. You actually need to start understanding the contents of the SBOM to make decisions as part of your process. You know, are the policy decisions? Are you using particular software licenses that may be not in accordance with your development policy? Are you using software from particular, maybe from particular ecosystems that you might not want to use, etc. So I think, you know, an SBOM is going to give you a lot of visibility, and it's possibly going to give you some headaches as well. But yeah.
I mean, I see that there are a lot of research coming out now indicating that between 80 and 90% of commercial software is actually open source. And legislations like CRA make the manufacturer responsible for all parts of their product. So they're going to have to start doing due diligence on this. And they're going to, as you say, discover a lot of interesting stuff. But talking about legislation, moving on to the next question. I wasn't aware of the word championships in the legislation, but I keep hearing that Europe is particularly proud of being the leader in software regulation. Previously, we've seen in the US that they have regulation for federal purchases. They have for vertical sectors like the medical industry, which you and I have listened to a lot of stories from and met a couple of lawyers. But Europe took the decision to legislate across the board for all digital products that wasn't regulated already. Everything from embedded system, OT technology, to mobile apps and games and toys, dishwashers. Is this a good or bad thing?
Oh, we could talk for hours on this, and I know there's people on the call who probably could chip in as well. I think we have to recognize software is global, and my concern is that there's lots of legislation coming out from the US, from Europe, from Japan, and even things that are just global as well. I think software is now global. The issue of software security is a global problem, and I think really what we want to try and do is make sure we're all going in the same direction. We have to start slowly, and I think creating an SBOM is the starting point. But we all need to make sure we're all pushing in the same direction. because most of us are using the same bits of software. We have software in our devices, we have software in our homes, and we all need to try and build a secure future for our customers and and our citizens. So I think Europe has a lot of strengths, particularly the EU, in terms of having a large community to direct legislation. I think we need to ensure that that legislation is appropriate and achievable, but which obviously will take time for us to realise it. But we've only, we can see what the benefits of EU has in the tech communities. We can see, the EU is very busy keeping the big tech companies honest. So ultimately, yeah, Europe is going to make software better, but actually we need to make sure we make the world better, not just Europe, because product providers want to sell to global audiences, not just a country or a community.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of I have split opinions here. As a consultant, I've been involved in many different projects where security has always been very prioritized so low, so it disappears in the backlog, and nothing happens. I keep getting promises that we'll take this seriously some other time, but let's focus on this blinking lamp or whatever cool feature they have to focus on. So I think in the end, the EU was kind of right when they said that the balance isn't right. Customers don't have the knowledge, they can't understand cybersecurity, and vendors needs to protect them. So the legislation shifts the balance towards the vendor to protect the users. I don't know how much will change in reality, but I think every small step is interesting here. But I fully agree with you that this is a global business with a global problem we need to focus on.
And I think we all see, various, generally governments saying, we need to be following secure by design. And there's lots of great best practices out there that, as developers and engineers, we want to follow. But they are just guidelines, they're not enforced. And, we clearly just having good guidelines out there in the community isn't delivering secure software. Complying with legislation seems to be, unfortunately, the only way to make people step up. It would be far better if we didn't have that, because it'd be far cheaper for businesses. But it will basically, legislation, unfortunately, seems to be the only way of achieving the desired behaviour in the way the software and products get produced, which is disappointing.
A related question is the cost in the material that CRA is based on. They acknowledge that the cost of producing software will go up, which will likely affect the prices. But having a more secure IT infrastructure will lower the cost for handling all kinds of attack, ransomware, and everything. But as a manufacturer, do you want to be the first in your gang to raise costs? Will that happen, or what do you think? Who will pay for all this?
I don't know. It's a really difficult question. Yeah, and I think, and I can see it's also about basically, keeping software, keeping products alive for at least 5 years, which is what the CRA wants. It's not software, product is not file and forget, issue and forget about it. I think that, there's a big behavior change being asked for. And we see it with our consumer devices as well. How many consumer devices you buy off an Amazon or wherever, and basically it never gets updated, and you don't know what risk that is going to do. So I think this is we're in a landmark stage. It's going to take time. The next few years is going to be, a great learning experience for lots of people.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So we talked about SBOM earlier, and the CRA kind of avoided the standard issue here, saying that they will come back with specifying which standard formats that are recommended. But what do? We have two different standards, OWASP Cyclone DX and Linux Foundation SPDX, and they're heading in really different directions. They have a shared core that we've seen in many documents, but apart from that, it's really hard to translate between them. Do we need to reboot and start a third standard to make it, or referring to the old XKCD?
Let's not. Okay. I think, first of all, I would hope legislation focuses on what information needs to be specified or contained, rather than saying how it is provided. I think the first thing is we need to make sure the information that people are being asked for in legislation is applicable and appropriate. How it gets packaged, whether it's an XML document or a JSON document or a spreadsheet, shouldn't really be in the legislation. And I think as an industry, I think we need to try and sort of work together. I saw a document that MITRE issued last week was saying there are some challenges with SBOMs, and one of them is because we've got these two standards, SPDX and Cyclone DX, that are going in different directions because they're recognizing slightly different use cases. And I think we need to think about how we ensure we make the life as easier for consumers of the SBOMs rather than the producers of SBOMs. And yeah, I've just seen in the chat about there's also software, there's SWID, which comes from the US, which is also an ISO standard, which is another way of specifying your ingredients. It's as an identifier. Yes, it'd be nice if we had a single way of just sharing the information agnostic to what the standard is. Maybe that's where we need to get to. And we focus on content.
I think we also have a sickness in the IT business that it's so fun with all these discussions, which is the best. And I find, maybe I'm getting too old for this, but I find it not very interesting. I find, as you say, exactly, the content is the king. And the SBOM file format is just a transport of data between systems.
Yes.
But the systems that manage the data, the software transparency data, like dependency track or your SBOM lens, those are what's important to me. So we'll see what happens here, and if we can shift the focus from standards, picking standards, to quality.
Yeah. So just before we go into quality, there is an initiative that CISA in the US are driving called ProtoBOM, which is trying to create a data model. And I think there's a number of other people looking at data models to just try and just talk about the content rather than the format. So yeah, there are maybe some recognition that we need to have some commonality. But yeah, quality is an interesting one. I mean, quality comes from a very simple view: is how do you know whether you've got a complete SBOM? And then you start thinking about, and how do you know whether it's correct? I think everyone I talk to doesn't really have an answer to it. I think generally at the moment people are saying having something is better than not having anything. But actually, I hope that we will, we'll get better. We rely on third-party data, metadata of ecosystems to actually provide the level of and quality of data we need to make those decisions. My recommendation has always been never trust one tool. I always used to do this when I was writing software. I would always compile my code using 2 compilers, and it would be amazing how different error messages I would get. So again, I would recommend using multiple SBOM tools to either create them or to consume them, and maybe think about the different formats as well. So yeah, I think this is something I think as a community we can help. It's
Yeah.
not something we, as an individual, a single person is going to solve.
No, that's one reason to continue with SBOM Europe. And the question of end users, we have a comment in the chat there that the CRA doesn't say anything about forcing manufacturers to share their SBOMs other than with the authorities if something happens. But for instance, in the medical sector in the US, manufacturers are more or less forced to change to share their SBOMs, can be under NDA, but with their customers. So as a customer, I really would like to have this as a requirement when I do public tenders or similar purchases. So what do you think? Is there any benefit today of customers getting SBOM access of the product they buy?
Yes, I think there's several angles to this. First of all, I'd like to know how the regulators are going to use SBOMs. I think that would be really interesting, because the effort in terms of product manufacturers creating them, I think we need to ensure we can see some benefits from the regulators. You know, are they just going to put them on a cloud storage and just never look at them? I think, you know, they're going to get, there's a whole amount of data mining you could do with across all the SBOMs from all the products. So you could start thinking about, well, maybe that would start identifying which open source products the particular government should be supporting, like we see in the Sovereign Tech Fund from Germany. That would be a great benefit that I could see coming from, you know, regulators helping the community. But I think also, if you know, if you wanted to, as a tender, say, is my software asking for an SBOM? First of all, if your product provider can provide an SBOM, I think that's a really good start. That shows they understand they need to be keeping track of these third-party components. And they are probably practicing a secure development lifecycle as well, which probably requires them to actually have good understanding. And they've probably got a good assurance process. They're probably practicing good GRC, government risk and compliance practices, which is probably going to give you a nice, warmer feeling than somebody says, well, what's an SBOM? So I think that should be, you know, it should help, you know, the manufacturers who are following good practices to become more visible.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of benefits if you have a large IT infrastructure. If you go back to the Log4j problem, then there was a need for SBOM there instead of sending all those mails and faxes and ask all those live calls. This is a question that I kind of meet all the time with my customers. They happily come back to me and say, oh, we created our SBOM, we're done. And I look at them and say, well, you're done with the first step of your SBOM journey, but you're not far from done. And here we can refer to CISA. They have different levels of SBOM, different types of SBOMs. And we're going to go back to that in our seminars. But you have runtime SBOMs, build system SBOMs, and a couple of others that are a little bit different. So when you have the first SBOM properly produced by a scanner of some kind, take that as a starting point, but you're far from done. Continue attending our seminars and you will learn more. But let's move on. Vulnerability management. This is something you and I spend a lot of time on, Anthony. Will SBOMs be useful in finding vulnerabilities?
Yes. I mean, we go back to the early comment about quality. The SBOMs are going to help in vulnerability management, provided the quality of the SBOM is good enough. And the big challenge you've got is you've got vulnerability databases freely available, and obviously some vendors have them as well that are obviously kept within their organization. Ultimately, mapping a vulnerability to a component requires some interaction. And if we have a good, accurate way of naming our components such that they map to the vulnerability databases, then it's going to be really useful. So if we have name our components using something called, for example, called Perl, which both Ollie and myself are following very actively with as part of ECMA 54, which will allow you to define an open source component with the ecosystem that it's part of and the version and maybe the architecture that you've been deployed. That will be really helpful at allowing you to have quite an efficient vulnerability management process. At the moment, I think vulnerability management is quite broad. It just says, yes, you're using this component without actually being a little bit more, which can lead to a lot of nugatory work. So I'm hoping that vulnerability management will become more refined over time as we get better resolution in our SBOMs.
Yeah, and this is a topic we can speak for hours about, including the recent problems with the National Vulnerability Database, the package URL issues, and the problems with the CPEs and everything. I think we have to come back to vulnerability management in a separate seminar. And I know
think vulnerability management is the sort of it's hyped as a sort of the top use case for SBOMs. It's not the only use case, as I think we've always said. SBOM is part of a risk management process, and vulnerabilities are just one of those risks you want to assess. But license compliance is just as important for some organizations. So yeah.
So we're running a bit out of time on the status thing, but we have one last slide to cover quickly. We see now statements flowing around on social media saying, "Oh, SBOMs have failed to do anything." What do you think there? Do you have any quick comments?
I think it's raised awareness. I think it's raised awareness that software is more complex than people ever realized. So your 10 lines of JavaScript is probably going to become 200,000 lines of JavaScript because of all the third-party components you bring in. So I think if nothing else, it's raising people's awareness that they need to be aware of or control how their developers are working and making sure they have some visibility. So
I think it really goes back.
It's early days. It's early days.
It's early days, and it goes back to the promise of a silver bullet, and people get disappointed. It's still early days, and there's a lot more work to be done here in order to get the full effect. So thank you, Anthony. We're gonna go on and cover the next topic, which will be rather brief. The Cyber Resilience Act is a massive change for the software industry, but we get a lot of questions about the SBOMs in the Cyber Resilience Act. In short, the Cyber Resilience Act is proposed now from the European Union. It's adopted, and it's going to be published any day now in the official journal of the European Union. But the idea here is to make vendors responsible for cybersecurity during the lifetime of a digital product. And that sentence says a lot of things, saying that the vendor is responsible for cybersecurity in the product, and they have to deliver free updates, and they have to take care of the product they sold for a long time. Each sold product, not a product line or an article number, each sold product. So after the final sale of our product, you still have a definition of a lifetime, which can vary. The default is 5 years, but if you have good reasoning, that can change. But it means a lot of changes. So where are we? Well, the current situation is that we see the publication happening any day now, and 20 days after that, the legislation will come into force. 21 months after that, not full 2 years, but 21 months, you have a responsibility for the vulnerability handling in your product. You have to have coordinated vulnerability disclosure, and you will have to report any incidents to ENISA or your local country cert. 36 months after that is the big change, which means your product have to be secure by default and secure by design and a lot of other issues. So that is the point where all products sold have to have the CE mark, which is now expanded. The old CE marking that we have on all electrical products is now expanded to include cybersecurity. So there are a lot of details to be said here, and we have run many seminars on this topic and the conference, the Nordic Software Security Summit. But in short, as a vendor, you have to deliver free security upgrades. You have to manage all your vulnerabilities. You have to have secure by design, check your source code, not only the third-party components, but your source code and your data protocols, data transfers, and everything. And from an SBOM point of view, this CRA is kind of interesting that it doesn't require you to give your customers access to the SBOM, but it says that if you allow them to, then this is what you do. So there is an opening there. It mandates manufacturer to have an SBOM, at least of the primary, the top level dependencies, which is interesting. And this has to be shared. I believe that for certain categories of products, where you require third-party certification, the requirements on SBOM will be much, much harder than this. But they also say that the manufacturer is responsible for all parts of the solution, including all third-party components. In order to manage that, you really need a full SBOM, not just the top level. So it's kind of problematic in the text here that they say two different things. So we'll see. This is just based on the CRA legislation text. In addition, there will be a lot of various documents, implementation guidelines, and horizontal standards you can use to self-certify your product as compliant with the CRA. And I think many of them will have different requirements, and we'll see that as they come in the coming years. So this is the starting point. Where we end, we don't know. Yeah. So with that,
and I clearly have an interesting view in terms of the CRA applies to the 27 states of the EU. As coming from the UK, where we're outside the EU.
Remind me, you were inside. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Now the UK, after we exited, CE marking for hardware products, we had an equivalent called the CA, but the CA and the CE are essentially the same, exactly the same text, just called different things. I have no idea whether the UK will adopt CE marking for software in the same way it has adopted CE marking for hardware products. It would be very sensible, I think, for us to maintain it, because obviously lots of UK companies will want to sell products into the EU. It's a big market still. But I've no idea whether the UK is going to follow the COA as well in the same timescales. So therefore, yes, and exactly what Daniel said on the in the chat, the Brussels effect, because legislation, would be useful, because I think the benefits would also be beneficial to UK and obviously other organisations who are not in the EU, who are maybe good friends of the EU. So because obviously, so it would be interesting to see that. Now I don't know whether we've got anybody who has got influence in the UK. I keep on talking to people to try and find out what their views are. I haven't got an answer yet. having a change of government in the last few months, I think they're still trying to find their feet. So yeah.
Yeah. So let's open up for questions from the audience. I want to remind you once again that we are recording this. If you don't want to be part of the recording, you have to wait with your questions until after we stop the recordings. But otherwise, feel free to turn on your video and your audio and ask questions.
Or you can just put it in the chat if you want, if you don't want to do that. I'll take one of the comments that I saw on the chat, just as well, people are thinking, which was, I think, from Hans about maybe because you've got so many different ecosystems like C and Go, Java, would a single SBOM standard help? Well, I think the ecosystems and the SBOM formats are quite independent. The SBOM formats is really about a way you document the information in a format, like a JSON document, an XML document, for example. Where that data has come from is the ecosystems. So it's really each ecosystem will have data that you might want to retrieve to then format in an appropriate way. So I think as long as the ecosystems have the information that the SBOM formats need, that I think that's the best way. So does it have the location of where you can maybe download the software from? Does it have a checksum? Does it have the name of the maintainer or the supplier? Does it have a good version strings? So various information like that are all useful to contain in an SBOM, but those are really ecosystem dependent rather than SBOM dependencies.
No. But we can add to that you and I have been in contact a couple of times now with the Apache Foundation, where they are thinking about how can they handle this within the various Apache projects. And in fact, we've been more involved with the Log4j project that have a very interesting attitude. They want to have an internal SBOM as well as an external one, but they want to use the internal one to make sure that at all times you can build Log4j for Java with a clean set of dependencies without vulnerabilities. And I think that's commendable. But they're taking the first steps, and there's a lot of discussions going on how to distribute, how to work with SBOMs.
And I think some of the discussions we had with them, they were sort of, who should create an SBOM? I mean, I've been in various discussions where, well, it's open source, anybody can create an SBOM, which is potentially true, but then, well, how do you know that's the definitive SBOM? Because, every tool has strengths and weaknesses. So which tool do you use? And if you use an SBOM and you create a tool, you create it, and then you find there's issues with it, well, can you go back to the original vendor to say, well, there's a problem if they hadn't created it? So I think what Apache were looking at is how could they create an SBOM which defined their environment in which how they tested their release process to say these are the dependencies, these are the versions of the dependencies we used, to almost try and give you an assurance to say, well, if you use these exact same versions, then you should get the same results. What they can't do is you can't control, many thousands of dependencies that the system may have in its, out of scope. So it is quite an interesting issue because they generally, Apache is generating libraries, which really then get built into applications, which then get put into systems. Well, there's a lot can happen between a library and a system.
Oh yeah. Daniel has a question. Do you want to turn on the microphone? Yeah.
Sure. So,
hello.
You were talking. Hi. You were talking before about how the CRA doesn't mandate the publication of an SBOM, and it struck me because I work with a lot of software manufacturers all over the world, and I find in more cases than not that they're not actually complying with the MIT license terms from the beginning, right? They're not including a copyright license, which they have to do. Like the wording of the MIT
Yep.
license says that you must disclose the copyright notice of the author of the library that you're using. And
Yep.
so I think that, and I love your perspective on this. Maybe this notion of dual SBOMs, where one SBOM fulfills the needs of your license compliance of disclosing which licenses you're using, and then the internal one for perhaps proprietary pieces. What do you think of that?
I do agree on that, and I have a couple of slides of that I won't show right now. But I think that this is something that comes up in the discussion about the Transparency Exchange API, where you have an internal process and you publish your material to the compliance department for exactly this kind of reason. But it's hard to get the proper licenses and get that done. But in many of these formats, you have the fields for the license and fields for copyright holders, and you need to make sure you maintain that. But I also think that in the internal SBOM, I would like in a software project to add references to, GitLab issues or other systems where we actually accepted adding a component, because I believe that it's easier now with the CRA to say that, well, even if this component was free, you as a product manager have to realize that every component you add adds to the cost of the lifetime management of your product. I talk about the cost per dependency, and that's something you can easily put in a spreadsheet, and they understand spreadsheets and costs. But there has to be some due diligence, and I would like to have a pointer back in the SBOM to where that happened and who were involved and what was the decision. But that's not necessarily information that I need to publish to my customers. But it's a very interesting discussion to discuss the internal SBOM versus the external one. And I think the CISAs, I think they have 7 types of SBOMs, but
So there's 6 types. I have a slightly different view, and I can understand where you're both coming from. The CISA identified the minimum contents of an SBOM in terms of what for a component, what it should have, name, version, supplier, and then, as Daniel's rightly saying, basically it doesn't include the copyright information, which again is your useful information. It didn't include the license information, again very useful. So therefore, there's people then promoting that we need to enrich SBOMs, and there's then people writing tools to enrich an existing SBOM to make it, more data. Now, my view is, if you've got the data, put it in at this stage. Don't restrict it based on the audience, because ultimately you don't know who the audience is going to be. I know there are concerns about regulators. Didn't we realize you're using that component? Just give them what they want. But actually, I think, if you start having different versions of, an SBOM and then generating 3 or 4 different copies of it, depending with different redactions, I think that will become a very onerous process.
I think
far better if you just had one and then assume the user was going to use it. Just look at the information he's looking for. So the compliance people are just going to look at the license information. They're not going to look at, GitHub commits or whatever. So, that's my view. Happy to discuss.
We need to continue this discussion, but
yeah,
I think I don't see it as different SBOMs. I see it as a process where I create one external based on the internal, but managing multiple in parallel, that would be awful.
Yes. Yeah, it's essentially what you're talking about is an SBOM viewpoint, which is like a data. It's like a database, because ultimately an SBOM is data, and you were providing you really wanted a view. So yeah. There's one more comment I've seen in the comment from Hans. which is about, yes, building the packages in different environments is going to get.
I think we will have to skip that for now
Yes.
and come back to that when we're discussing vulnerability management.
Yes.
Because we're running out of time, the clock is ticking, and I think we just need to finalize this with a couple of pointers. Anthony and I will run and participate in various events in the future. In November, we have a seminar about the OWASP Transparency Exchange API, which is a project I'm spearheading. This is an API that will create an ECMA standard for the exchange of various software transparency artifacts, SBOM, VEX files, and other things we haven't discussed today. So this webinar is a free webinar, and you're welcome to join it if you're interested. This is part of the process where either a manufacturer gets data from upstream vendors or a customer gets from their suppliers. I will also be talking at OWASP Benelux. I will have a conference session and a tutorial in Utrecht, Netherlands. And you have the link to that conference over there. And Anthony, you have a webinar as well in November.
So I have a webinar. It's hosted by Cheltenham and Gloucester BCS, British Computer Society interest group, local group. But obviously, it's a webinar, so anybody can dial in. It's talking about software transparency, and spoiler alert, SBOMs will be mentioned quite heavily. So it's, I think it's 6:30 UK time in 2 or 3 weeks time, 12th of November.
Yep. And our next SBOM Live webinar, number 2, is November 19th. There's already a placeholder on Eventbrite if you want to register. We haven't set the full agenda, but we are planning to have one of our guests joining us for an interesting webinar with a really cool SBOM-related topic. And you can find more information about the events both on LinkedIn, SBOM Europe, or on our website. And with that, I think it's time to say thank you from both of us. And hopefully we'll see you soon again on this channel. Any final words, Anthony?
No, thank you very much.
May the SBOM be with you.
Yes. Yes. So if you've got any feedback, reach out to us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Yeah.